Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the this afternoon's working group on foreign fighters returning from Syria. What to do about them? For those of you who have made it this far in the conference, the last session of the final day, my congratulations. You'll get your certificates of completion in the mail, along with your baseball cap and T-shirt. At any rate, it is always my I love the working groups part of the conference. I mean, the plenary sessions are always rich and full of material, but it's the working groups really where you get to look at a specific topic and you at any rate where you get to look at a specific topic and really get into it. So we've got a good long session here. This is a terrific panel of speakers. It's extraordinary, and there's a lot of us, as you can see. So we're going to try to go through that. I'm going to introduce my fellow members of this panel just very briefly. I'm just going to give you a one-liner of who they are. They're all extraordinarily experienced people, and the experiences are quite diverse, and that's good that we will have that perspective. And then I'm going to sort of try to set the scene with a few remarks, and then we will go right through it. So on my immediate left, we have Colonel Rateb Amro, the founder and director general of the Horizon Strategic Studies in Jordan, and a friend of mine. We've had the opportunity to talk about these things before, and I'm so pleased that you're here with us this afternoon. We have Deborah Margolin, who is now at the Center for the Extremism Center at George Washington University, which, as you know, has done some splendid work in this area. I mean, real empirical research, and that's a new assignment for her, and we've had the opportunity to work before together. We have Dr. Vera Mironova from Harvard University in the United States, and she has had some really extraordinary recent personal experiences in Iraq. I'm going to ask you as a favor, for those of you who are tweeting, and being my age, this is a new phenomenon that people actually tweet while they listen. But for those of you who are inclined to do that, if you would not mention her or do any sort of live obscene things while she's speaking, and then an old friend of mine, one of the veterans of many conferences and campaigns and discussions on counter-terrorism, Dr. Magnus Ranstorp, who is the research director of the Center for Asymmetric Threat Studies at the Swedish National Defense College. We thank you for releasing an American hostage recently. And then we have another. Everyone on this panel is friends of mine, and they are. It's true. Dr. Daphne Richmond Barak, who is the head of the International Law Desk at the ICT, and also the head of Law and Security Program at the IDC here. And then Ms. Emerita Torres, the Director of Research and Programs at the Soufan Center in the United States, which also does some really terrific work. Now, I I've mentioned them in order of looking at them. They're not going to speak in that order, and I will get that right when it comes to speaking time. You have more biographical information about each one of them, but we'll launch right into the talk. So which button do I press here to make my? Aha. So let me very, very quickly kind of set the scene here, and we're going to be talking about the foreign fighters. Are we prepared for the challenge? As you know, by quick background, the civil war in Syria attracted thousands of volunteers, even before the creation of ISIS, before there was a formal al-Qaeda affiliate there. But ISIS, which was especially effective in social media, attracted tens of thousands. I've seen a number 40,000. I've seen a number 50,000. First observation here, all of the numbers are slippery. And that's interesting. And months later, in terms of how many are at the camps and so on, the numbers are still slippery, which is an indication of where we are or where we are not on this particular issue. Now, as the Islamic State fell, many of them were killed. A lot of the foreign fighters, in fact, were used as cannon fodder. They were not likely to. They had limited utility because if ISIS was looking ahead to an underground contest in Syria, a lot of the foreign fighters weren't going to be suited for an underground contest because they were foreigners. So they were simply a commodity to be expended in the defense. Some of them were killed. Some of them fled. Some of them relocated to other fronts. Some of them returned home. Some of them we have no idea where they are. They're at large. The Syrian forces now, the Syrian democratic forces now hold about 1,000 to 2,000 who are considered to be foreign fighters. Again, slippery numbers here. How many of them are it's a number that keeps changing, plus thousands, and the number here is running around perhaps 10,000 or more jihadi wives and children, held along with tens of thousands of others who are, in a sense, displaced by the fighting. The women and children represent a particular challenge. Normally, it would be easy. They would be considered victims to be taken care of, but in this case, it's a bit more complicated than that. So sorting out the women and children is a major issue. Many of those from the West want to return. They are not welcome, and that's part of the problem. This is not such a big problem for the United States because our numbers are relatively small. We had several hundred foreign fighters, but that number includes would-be foreign fighters who failed to get to Syria or failed to connect with a group and came back, or actually the authorities became very, very good at intercepting them. And of those who tried to go after 2012, actually, the FBI was intercepting 43% of them. So that was pretty good. Now, what will happen to them, what happens to them, is going to really impact the situation in Syria and Iraq. It's going to impact the continuing jihad in the region and beyond. Legal constraints, fears of terrorism, overburdened security services, public hostility, risk-averse politicians impede their return. And that remains the environment. On the other hand, leaving them in Syria risks their escape or a mass jailbreak or changing conditions in which we will end up having to capture them again. And by the way, if you do some back-of-the-envelope math on this and look at, put aside the threat they may pose, the mere costs of killing or capturing a jihadi by Western-backed military power, I think it would be a little bit cheaper to buy every one of them a villa in the south of France. I mean, this is a costly and dangerous thing. So what are the options? By the way, I don't want to miss that last point. There is a humanitarian disaster in the making here. The camps are vastly overcrowded, it whether from disease or whatever, this could overnight turn into a disaster. So what are the options? Could turn them loose. President Trump has threatened to do so, though that's more an expression of his impatience at some of America's European allies who have been reluctant to take them back themselves. Obviously, it would be dangerous. It's not really a realistic option. The fight still goes on, and so I don't see turning them loose as a real option. But it's easy to imagine scenarios in which it would involve escape or release. Leave them in the desert. Now, that has a kind of appeal to it. It sounds tough, kind of has a biblical quality to it. Let's strip them of their citizenship. And there. But that merely displaces the future risk. And we'll end up, as I said before, we'll end up dealing with them again. And it also is really an affront to something that has been carefully constructed over decades, and that is the notion, whoops, can I go backward? Without starting over? At any rate, look, the whole idea in combating terrorism has been this is an international effort. It's not a national effort. And the idea that, well, we'll leave them out there, there'll be somebody else's problem in the future is, as I say, directly contrary to that. In some cases, countries have gotten away with stripping citizenship, but there are also international legal issues about stripping citizenship. You can't render people stateless, and we'll hear more about that. We can turn them over to the Iraqi or Syrian government. The Iraq, in fact, has taken custody of some of them and has tried them. It has offered to take the lot for a reported $2 billion. Those who have been dealt with by Iraqi justice thus far have been found guilty and sentenced to death. That creates an awkward situation for countries that do not agree with the death penalty. My own guess is that those sentences will not be commuted, but they will not be carried out. There will be Westerners in Iraqi prisons. That has actually the embryos of future political scandals and problems. So far as turning them over to Syria, Syria is already accused of war crimes. That's not likely to happen. Can we pay the Kurds to hold on to them? You just keep them. Problem with that, as the Kurds tell us, they have no capacity for long-term incarceration. The Kurds that have been the allies of the coalition dealing with ISIS is a paramilitary force. This is a militia. This is not a sovereign state. And so that raises another legal issue that we will get into. It would be at most an interim measure to buy some time to allow to sort this thing out, but short-term temporary measures can sometimes turn into long-term measures. The one that is favored by many people is to repatriate them and prosecute them at home. That is, French nationals go back to France, Belgians go back to Belgium, and so on. As I say, some European governments say that is the theoretically preferred solution, certainly the preferred policy set forth by the United States. But Europe is already dealing with powerful anti-immigrant sentiments, and the laws by which they might be prosecuted vary from country to country. Rules of evidence vary from country to country. The evidence that comes from a battlefield in Syria might not be admissible in a court, so trials are problematic if they were brought back to Europe and not prosecuted or tried and there was insufficient evidence to convict them, then they would be, in a sense, on the loose. So that's not a necessarily a popular solution. Even if they were convicted, jail sentences are often quite short in European countries, and prisons in Europe and some of the countries have turned out to be incubators for future generations of terrorists. So this is not necessarily a solution. But there are real and there are real risks here. Thus far, we haven't seen foreign fighters returning and going immediately back into terrorist activities. But it's still early days, and it's hard to see what will happen. I mean, talking to many of my friends in the security services in Europe, they say, yes, I suppose the country does have an obligation to bring them back and do something with them, but personally, I just prefer that we don't. They're overstretched anyway, trying to keep track of the people who the frustrated travelers who haven't left, those who are still radicalizing. Don't dump another layer on top of our tasks. There could be some sort of an international tribunal or a new one created. The International Criminal Court is not enthusiastic about taking delivery of them. Normally it deals only with the crimes of genocide, mass murder, ethnic cleansing. It normally deals with individual leaders, not batches of people. ICC proceedings take years. Sweden has proposed a European tribunal, but thus far there's not consensus. I don't see consensus yet on this. Now, this one has come up occasionally, that the U.S. will assume custody as detainer of last resort. At one time they mentioned that there were about 800 Western foreign fighters. We have 795 beds available at Guantanamo. Problem solved. I think that would arouse enormous international opposition. We have learned, because of our errors at the beginning, that Guantanamo detainees become permanent wards. Once we get them, we can't give them back to anybody. And our military tribunals have, in the 18 years since 9/11 and people being brought to Guantanamo, I don't know if the figure is 6 or 5, we've completed trials of individuals. It's a number in that area. It's fewer than a dozen. So the military tribunal system is sclerotic. The only thing that's likely to end up in a U.S. court are some of the detainees, those who participated in atrocities against Americans, those who were involved in the beheading of American hostages. There's a couple of them. That is a possibility that a few of the high-profile ones are identified and would be brought back to the United States and tried in a U.S. court. Bluster and muddle is really not an option. It's sort of policy by default. It's kind of where we are now. It's the status quo. That is, yes, warnings of what will happen if we don't do something, It prompts concern, but international coordination is just very complicated. Each country does its own thing, and so some combination of some of them stay there, some of them go to Iraq, some of them are taken home. Somehow, over time, hopefully it works out. And as I say, it's a muddling policy, but that's probably what we have now. I call these options because these are all theoretically options, but the operative term is theoretical. A lot of them aren't real options. Most of them are simply avoidance strategies. That is, how do we kick this can down the road and not deal with it? There's no one obvious solution. Some of the preferred solutions are just very difficult, may not be feasible. And so again, I think what we may well see is a kind of a mishmash of repatriation, denaturalization, trials in multiple countries. We could improve the process by really interviewing and sorting out things while they are still there and then seeing how we might handle them. And I see that the Europeans, if I read the latest reports right, have just agreed upon a system of sharing information on a master list and sharing evidence. Okay, so that's a step toward that. But as I say, if we don't do something, then we're certainly not going to break the jihadi cycle, and this is going to happen again and again. I do think, by the way, among these detainees, to be sure, some of them are traumatized, disillusioned. Some of them remain determined, probably, but there has to be among some of them opportunities for us, in the sense of exploiting them to assist in programs in dissuading others from joining jihad and doing destructive and self-destructive things. So that's basically where we are. In terms of numbers where we are, I think it's about a third are reportedly have returned. That is probably the least dangerous bunch. A lot of them are the ones who went early when there was still a lot of humanitarian activity as opposed to radical jihadist activity. And so they were the first out and the first back. But those who went later on are going to be less innocent. That brings me back to the women and children. There's been a few repatriations thus far. The women, in many cases, are radical. They went as radicals. They participated in enforcement and enforcement activities in the Islamic State while it existed. It is difficult to know how to interpret what they say now either way. They may say they are out of it, done with it, were dragged along by their husbands or by illusions, and that may or may not be true. On the other hand, those who are still, in a sense, posing as unrepentant, we know that within the camps there is still an ISIS enforcement operation going on. And if you think you're going to be left in the desert, you want to hedge your bets and not go ahead and declare how you want nothing more to do with the Islamic State. So they say what is being reported by reporters as to what they're saying is not necessarily reliable. Numbers elusive and slippery, no coordinated approach. That's the background. So I've already gone through today's speakers, and let me, without further delay, ask Colonel Amro to come up, and the Colonel, because of other reasons, is going to have to depart right after his presentation. But he has assured me that in his presentation, he has answered all of the questions you would have asked. So